Hi everyone, and welcome to another lecture for Crim 210. So for this week, we're going to be focusing on gang involvement, and then the lecture after this will just be like an optional lecture for students. You can watch it if it's a topic that interests you, but it's not going to be on the final exam. Then after this lecture, or that lecture, we'll also have a final exam review as well, where I'll just go through the slides and talk about some of the key themes from the lectures so far this semester. But to move on, we're going to talk a little bit about gangs, or a lot about gangs, and we need to start with kind of looking at what gangs are, beginning with what the definition of a gang is, how prevalent gangs are, and the importance of gangs to understanding involvement in criminal behavior. So we'll begin with defining gangs, and we have different ways to define gangs. The Criminal Code of Canada actually has its own definition of gang involvement, where it talks about the definition of a criminal organization, which is comprised of 3 or more persons who are interacting specifically to help facilitate or commit criminal activity that is for profit. So they're looking at serious offenses in particular, where the main kind of purpose is to actually benefit from that crime, as opposed to like a random fight outside of a bar, for example. So it's actually like section 46.11 of the Canadian Criminal Code excludes persons that randomly commit a single offense together. It's more about those individuals who actually purposefully get together for the purpose of committing a serious offense that will yield some type of profit. Police services also have a definition of a gang that talks about a gang as a group that engages in intimidation and violence, and engages in criminal acts to gain power and or to control or monopolize certain types of unlawful activity like drug trafficking. When we look at research, there are 2 ways that researchers tend to define gangs. One is to just look at official data, and whether an individual is gang involved or not depends on whether police have labeled them as a gang, or a probation officer has said that they are been involved in gang activity, something like that. But what research can also do, and this is something that I'll talk about today, is interview individuals and ask them about gang activities. So this is where we would get self-report data, where certain individuals might self-nominate themselves as gang members. One thing that's, I think, very difficult to put a specific number on is the prevalence of gangs in Canada. So a while back, there was a Canadian police survey to try and figure out how many youth gangs there actually were. So this is where police agencies reported to the government of Canada the number of gangs that they thought were in their jurisdiction and the number of gang members associated with those gangs. So across Canada, this survey suggested that there were a total of 434 youth gangs and 7,000 members of those gangs. I take a couple of issues with this approach. One, and I think the most important one, is that, and I'll argue this later, there's not really so much of a thing as a youth gang. We'll see that most gangs include a wide range of members of different ages, and not just like if you are 17, you can be part of the gang, but if you graduate to age 18, you're no longer allowed to be part of the gang. It doesn't really work that way. There isn't really such a thing as a youth gang that says only youth can be part of the gang. The results of this survey also show that Ontario has the most gangs and the most gang members, which isn't all that surprising given that it's the largest province. Saskatchewan had the highest ratio of gang members to gangs. One of the things that this can indicate is that these gangs might be particularly stable, that they might be more enduring, they might last longer. BC has several high-profile gangs, some that are no longer as prominent as others. We also know that there's a fairly big Hells Angels presence in British Columbia. In the past, we've talked about gangs like Red Scorpions, United Nations, and Independent Soldiers. And since that time, we've seen especially because of police intervention and incarceration, some factions or some different sects or sets of gangs that have emerged from the United Nations gang and from the Red Scorpions gang. Indigenous persons make up about 20% of Canada's gang population, which obviously is an overrepresentation when we look at the population of Canada in general. So for example, in BC, about 7% of the population is Indigenous. So we could see a disproportionate number of Indigenous persons being gang members. But at the same time, When we look at the prevalence of Indigenous persons in the justice system, it's 20% or higher. In some places or some provinces, it's upwards of like 40-50% in places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So by this number, you can also suggest that compared to the average person involved in the justice system, Indigenous persons were actually less likely to be involved in gangs. That said, I think that it's pretty tough to figure out what the prevalence of gangs actually is in Canada, because gang membership and gangs themselves change constantly. Individuals will move in and out of gangs. We're going to sort of debunk the myth that gangs are for life, this notion of like blood in, blood out, that is talked about in a lot of rap songs. When we actually look at the data, when we actually look at individuals' average length of time in the gang, it can be relatively short, even like less than a year on average. Gang members don't stay gang members necessarily for very long, and they will switch gangs, or certain gangs will sort of fold relatively quickly and other individuals might join like other gangs. The other potential issue is that the survey is based on what police are aware of and not necessarily what truly existed. So there's a very real possibility that these numbers are underestimating the true prevalence of gangs in Canada. So why would we even want to know about the prevalence of gangs? Like, what would this information tell us? One of the things that it can tell us is how much resources police need to allocate to gangs, or should there even be, like in Vancouver, there's like a dedicated VPD gang squad. Is this gang squad even necessary? Are gang members actually even more likely to commit harm, to traffic drugs, compared to other crime-involved individuals who are not involved in gangs? So these are like questions that research needs to answer so that we can definitively say whether gangs are actually important or not. When we're looking at gang involvement, one of the things that we're most concerned with is gang-related homicides. If we were to go based on what the media says, we might think that gang homicides are responsible for the majority of homicides in Canada. But in reality, in Canada, there are about 105 homicides that are related to gang involvement each year, which represents only about 20% of all the homicides committed in Canada. So in this graph, you can see the frequency of gang-related homicides in all provinces and territories other than BC and Alberta at that top black line. And then you can see the two dotted lines representing BC and Alberta. If we add those lines up, we get to about 105 gang-related homicides per year. But we would see about 500 homicides of all types in Canada in any given year. What we also can elucidate from this graph is that BC and Alberta tend to be disproportionately responsible for gang-related homicides in Canada. Is 105 homicides per year a lot? Or if we're looking at BC, is like 15 to 20 gang-related homicides per year a large number of gang-related homicides? Well, we could take a look at what we might find in Chicago. So in Chicago, we can see here at this graph, like in 1 month, in August, there were 96 homicides. So if 20% of those are gang-related, then in Chicago there's about 20 gang-related homicides each month. In Chicago, it's almost like the number of gang homicides that occur each month is about the same number of gang homicides that we can expect to occur in British Columbia in any given year. In BC, the prevalence of homicide is about 1/12 what we might expect to see in Chicago. Moreover, BC is about twice the population of Chicago, so it's about 1/24 the homicide rate that we would expect to see in Chicago. So I'm not trying to downplay the severity of gang-related homicide in British Columbia and in Canada, but I just want to illustrate that compared to certain places in the United States, for example, the prevalence of gang homicide is actually quite low. But again, just because it's low doesn't mean that it does not actually matter, especially because once one gang homicide occurs, we tend to see a domino effect. So this is a study done by my colleague Martin Bouchard and one of his grad students, Sadaf Hashimi, who's now an assistant professor in Nebraska. And they looked at 4 waves of gang homicides in the sort of Greater Vancouver Regional District. And I'll just sort of zoom in on the graph here, and what you can see is that there was a spike in homicide offending. In the middle wave, there was a homicide of a high-profile gang member, and this sort of sparked the wave. Violence erupts and then sort of escalated. So they focused on the 4 waves and examined whether one or more high-profile members who experienced a gang homicide victimization could be found. Basically, all homicide waves included a high-profile homicide of a deeply involved gang member or a gang leader. And these can be important as like the loss of a leader increases the incentive for revenge and the start or persistence of a gang conflict. We begin to see this like tit-for-tat violence where gangs start looking to target core members. So we kind of have a sense of like the prevalence of gangs and the definition of gangs. What do gangs actually look like and what do they do? We can begin to distinguish gangs according to organizational structure. And what I would say is that it's sometimes quite difficult to fit gangs into one nice, neat box. Like, are they a street gang or are they an organized crime group? Sometimes it's hard to fit them into these nice, neat categories, especially because over time, gang members will join or leave that particular gang. Leaders will change their opinions or attitudes about the type of gang they want to be or the structure of that gang. So there's fluidity to gangs. We can also see that organized crime groups, they'll actually associate with street level gangs as a way to insulate their risk. These more organized groups might not want to be like on the street or doing dial-a-dope operations in their cars, so they need the street level gangs to move their product. I tend to prefer to think about gangs in terms of like a hierarchy or a dynamic nature of the gangs. They can be more or less organized as opposed to saying they are disorganized or they are organized. Some of the ways that gangs can be organized are based on whether they have a gang name, whether they have a leader or specific hierarchy, whether the gang has specific meetings, rules, or initiations, whether the gangs have specific symbols, tattoos, or colors that represent the gang, and whether the gang operates specific territory. Historically, we could distinguish gangs according to whether they were representing a specific ethnicity or race, whether they were representing a specific age group, or a specific purpose or motivation, like to make money or to occupy a particular territory. These could be all different purposes of a particular gang. In Chicago, for example, some gangs, their purpose might be protection. We don't necessarily see that in British Columbia. I would also say that no longer do we really see gangs that can be distinguished based on all being of a specific ethnic group. Even the Hells Angels, which was supposed to initially be a whites-only motorcycle club, has now began to include individuals of different ethnic backgrounds. And this is especially because they had trouble recruiting new individuals. And there were other gangs in BC that were growing in size. And so if the Hells Angels didn't adapt and begin to associate with non-white individuals, they would begin to lack the size to have that control or monopoly over certain drugs or certain territory. As I mentioned off the bat, I also think that it's not really accurate to say that there are youth gangs and adult gangs. As another way to insulate themselves from risk, more organized, more adult gangs will also recruit young persons to do the more mundane tasks or the more risky tasks like drug selling. As well, if the gang wants to grow, they need to begin to recruit. And so they need to recruit at a young age to make sure, or recruit individuals at a young age to make sure those individuals don't join other gangs. There are also different motivations for gangs or why somebody would want to join a gang. And I'll go over some data later on, but some of the main reasons include protection, family ties, so if the family is in the gang or there are friends in the gang, that might increase the likelihood of wanting to join gangs. Some might see it as an opportunity for fast money or excitement, or they want to be able to engage in a greater amount of criminal behavior, and by joining the gang that will expose the individual to delinquent peers, and that will give them greater opportunities to engage in crime. The idea of joining a gang for protection is maybe a little bit more specific to US-based gangs or gangs in other countries. In Canada, or especially at least in Vancouver, we see more of a motivation for joining gangs being related to earning fast money and excitement, as opposed to, for example, needing protection from other offenders in the community. On the topic of excitement, some individuals want to be part of a gang because it is going to be intense, it is going to be exciting. I think I talked about in the psychopathy lecture how one individual said to me that you haven't felt empowered until you hold a gun to somebody's head. There can be real benefits from the perspective of certain individuals for joining a gang. Some of us might not think that being part of a gang would be fun at all, but you have to put yourself in the minds of the people who have chosen to be part of this gang, where they get to engage in crime that's very thrill-seeking. They're going to make money that's going to be able to allow them to afford different things, certain privileges. They're going to not have to be in school. They're not going to have to work like a difficult construction job. So these can all be like motivations where individuals will sincerely draw pleasure from being part of the gang. What are some things to look for to identify, for example, if you're a probation officer and your client is a 16-year-old youth, what are some of the signs that they would be involved in a gang? So one would be whether like a parent or teacher has come across score sheets, which is basically like a ledger accounting for who owes what, who buys what, how much money someone owes, to keep track of drug sales. Scales as well are necessary for individuals to weigh drugs, so that can be another sign of gang membership. Multiple phones are especially common in the lower mainland because, as opposed to occupying specific territory, gangs might be more likely to do daladope operations, so driving around in cars delivering drugs to people. Tattoos and clothing can be another important sign. For example, for Hell's Angels, you might see an 8-1 tattoo. Why 8-1? 8 represents the 8th letter of the alphabet, which is an H, and 1 represents the first letter of the alphabet, which is an A. So put those 8-1 together and you get HA, or Hell's Angels. When it comes to white supremacist gangs, you might see the tattoo 3-1-1. So K is the 11th letter of the alphabet, and if you do 3 times K, you get KKK. Offspring also did a song about, it's called Pretty Fly for a White Guy, and he talks about how this guy went to a tattoo parlor to ask for a 13, but they drew a 31.
Now he's getting a tattoo, yeah, he's getting ink done. He asked for a 13, but they drew a 31. Friends say
13 is associated with the El Salvadorian gang Mara Salvatrucha, and sometimes this gang is referred to as MS-13. I think one of the most important things that I would like to communicate to students about youth gang involvement is that gang boundaries are kind of fuzzy. It's not as if gang members work only with other gang members. Gang members will work with individuals who are not part of the gang whatsoever, as well as individuals who are in other gangs. I'm very sorry if you can hear a bunch of banging. There's been construction in my neighborhood for the last 3 years, and there's just nothing I can do about it. Understanding of gang boundaries is really important for understanding the scope of gang activity. Gang activity is not confined solely to its gang members. So the whole, aka the gang, is greater than the sum of its parts, aka the gang members. Just because one particular gang has 30 gang members doesn't mean that there are only 30 people committing crimes on behalf of that particular gang. There will be gang members working with even a rival gang sometimes. We've seen this with the Red Scorpions gang. Or we'll see gang members working with other associates who aren't part of the gang to engage in different types of crime. Later on in the lecture, I'm going to talk about a really important methodological and theoretical technique we use to study gang members, which is called social network analysis. One of the things that we can do with social network analysis is understand gang boundaries. Who do gang members affiliate with? So I'm going to zoom in on this slide and I'll tell you what I want you to look at just for right now. You can see little subscripts next to these different squares. Some of them are triangles, but they're called nodes. These shapes are called nodes. And the little GM subscripts identify individuals who are members of a specific gang. So in my young offender study, we identified 18 individuals who were members of one specific gang. And these 18 individuals co-offended with 119 individuals. So these 18 individuals co-offended with almost 120 different people. Now, if you look at these nodes, you'll notice that the vast majority of these nodes don't have that GM subscript next to them. What that means is that they were not gang members. So if we look at this network of gang members, these 18 gang members who co-offended with another 119 people, only about 1/4 of those 119 individuals were also members of that same gang. So another way of saying it is like almost 100 individuals in this network were individuals that were not actually part of the gang. So that kind of illustrates how frequently gang members co-offend with non-gang members. So one myth is that gang members will only commit crimes with fellow gang members. Another myth is that there is a lot of loyalty within the gang. What we tend to see is a lot of evidence for gang members who will testify against another gang member. So this is sometimes called like different slang that's been talked about in pop culture, like drop a dime on someone. We've seen it permeate all the way into Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Hi.
Hi.
You remember Martine, the Mellon's nanny? From the pool party. Yeah, she's having a bit of a problem.
A problem, I'll say. Mr. Mellon fired me. It's my suitcase. Doesn't have wheels.
Oh.
So she came over here.
It seems that one of the guests felt the cabana bathroom was beneath him and made his way into the main house. And
How did he find out?
Margarita, the cook, she's got a problem with me. She told that I was the person that let the guest in.
She squealed on you?
She ratted.
And he fired you?
And he fired me. Well, of course, I remember what you said about, that you would be responsible if anything happened, so...
Did you tell him that it was me?
No, I don't dime. I didn't dime. So,
Where this term comes from is basically when payphones cost only 10 cents. To drop a dime would be to drop a dime into a telephone and rat out somebody. Canadian music royalty, the Tragically Hip, have also talked about this, but they put a Canadian spin on it and they talked about dropping a caribou back when it cost 25 cents to make a call on a payphone.
Dead to rights and wide awake. Drop a caribou. I'm telling you. I'm telling you. Telling
I don't know how to pronounce his name, Tekashi99, something like that. We've seen him in the media a lot, especially recently because a Netflix documentary, I think it's on Netflix, came out about him, where he ratted out a bunch of different gang members. And this is not just something that we see in pop culture or in the media. We see this locally as well. When we look at the Red Scorpions gang, their leader, Michael Lay, was involved in the Surrey 6 homicides that took place maybe 15 years ago. And he ended up ratting out on basically all of his fellow gang members. He testified in court about who did what, who said what. In terms of the local context, if you're interested, I highly recommend following Kim Boland's blog, The Real Scoop. Look at it every day and even look at the comments. I'm not sure if it's as active now as it was in the past, but gang members would literally be commenting on her article, saying what she got right, saying what she got wrong. And if you follow her on Twitter, you can get a sense of this as well. But she's got an excellent understanding of the history of gang involvement in the Greater Vancouver Regional District. So in Vancouver in the 1990s, in the South Slope of Vancouver, we saw the rise of ethnic gangs and especially Indo-Canadian violence, where persons like Bindi Johal were at the center and were associated with this gang called the Punjabi Mafia, where these individuals were associated primarily with a Sikh heritage. But then from the 90s to the mid-2000s, we saw a transition into multi-ethnic gangs. And maybe this was most prominent or most sort of on the nose with the United Nations gang that was founded by Clayton Roosh, who's now in jail in the United States. We saw sort of a rivalry between some gangs working with Hells Angels and other gangs working against Hells Angels. And the UN would be one of the gangs working against the Hells Angels. And their entire basis of calling themselves the UN was, we will be like the UN, we will include everybody. More recently, in the late 2010s up until now, we've seen even Hells Angels at least associating with and doing work with individuals who were non-white. So in the late 90s to mid-2000s, we saw the rise of the United Nations, Red Scorpions, and independent soldiers, where ethnicity does not matter. Then, especially following the Surrey 6 trial, where Michael Lay ratted out a lot of his Red Scorpion gang members, and then we saw kind of a mass incarceration of Red Scorpion gang members, we began to see a splitting where some individuals joined what's called the Wolf Pack, which includes individuals who were formerly Red Scorpions, formerly Independent Soldiers, and formerly Hells Angels, versus the Dak Dure group and the United Nations group. Following the creation of these gangs, especially when we look outside of Vancouver through to Metro Vancouver, we can see multiple crime groups forming based on kind of loose allegiances and friend groups, especially along the Surrey Delta border. If you're not following any of this, kind of like good, you're not supposed to. My point here is that we see so much change in the gang landscape. The idea that there are crime families that run certain areas of Vancouver over 20, 30 years is just complete nonsense. We see a lot of turnover amongst gangs. Alright, so we'll take a look at this sort of flow chart here that kind of illustrates in the 1990s the emergence of Punjabi soldiers and other groups on the South Slope of Vancouver. Then we see individuals who are members of Punjabi soldiers go on to actually be part of these different gangs. So the green arrows you see there are where individuals actually moved from Gang 1 to Gang 2. So Punjabi soldiers became members of the UN gang, became members of Red Scorpions, and became members of the Dak Dure group. But if we look at those other three gangs, these red arrows show that they were all actually also in conflict with one another. The Punjabi soldier gang members are now actually in conflict with one another now that they've joined these different gangs like UN, RS, and the Dak Dure group. So the Dak Dure group came in conflict with Red Scorpions, where they murdered Jonathan Bacon with help from the United Nations. But members of the Dak Dure group were also at one point in time actually mentors to the Bacon brothers. When we look at the Red Scorpion gang, they had almost two sets. There was the Abbotsford area group that was the Bacon brothers, and then the Tri-City Vancouver group, which was sort of led by Michael Lay. And if you look at sort of the different comments that have been said in court, it sort of felt like these two sets had different motivations for gang involvement. The Red Scorpion gang members in the Abbotsford area, like the Bacon brothers, they kind of wanted the notoriety. They wanted to be known as gang members. They wanted kind of that street cred. Whereas Michael Lay, who had connection to Big Circle Boys, which is a very secretive, well-run, organized gang based out of East Asia, wanted to run it more like a business for making money. And so it's not just that there are rivalries between gangs, we can see internal debate, at least within the gangs. Not everybody within the gang is pulling on the rope in the same direction. Another reason for the hit on Jonathan Bacon was because members of the UN gang had actually defected to Red Scorpions. So one of these individuals, Kevin LeClaire, was a UN gang member that defected to the Red Scorpions. Following the homicide of Bacon brother, we saw a formation of different gangs. The Wolf Pack included members of Red Scorpions, Independent Soldiers, and Hells Angels that wanted to sort of get back at the individuals who had put the hit on Jonathan Bacon. Almost immediately within the Wolfpack gang, there was some conflict. And these individuals either joined or formed the gang that's now known as Brothers Keepers. And so Brothers Keepers included individuals who were former Wolfpack members, but now Brothers Keepers and Wolfpack are actually fighting against one another. So when we're talking about the survival or the success of a gang, we're talking about gang longevity. So gang members, especially those individuals at the top of the hierarchy, have a stake in the gang's longevity. The longer it lasts, the more money that they'll make. Early ethnographic research. So ethnographic research is where usually like a single individual will go and like sort of embed themselves within the gang, like not secretly or anything like that, but they will follow gang members around to get a sense of what the gang is actually like. There's a book by Venkatesh called Gang Leader for a Day that can give you a sense of what ethnographic research is like. I just want to caution students that he was maybe, and there's been information to arise suggesting that he might not be the most ethical or moral person, and there are some concerns that he might simply be fabricating some of the things that he has observed and written about in the book, or at least really exaggerated things. I recommend reading the book, but read it keeping that information that I just gave you in mind. Martin Bouchard, a colleague here at SFU, as I mentioned, he did a study with Marie Ouellette, who's a former grad student, and found that 80% of gangs last less than 3 years. So they end quite quickly. So what are the things that help a gang actually last longer? So we can basically look at 6 different aspects of longevity: recruitment, diversity, initiation, cohesion, criminal behavior, and alliances. And it's not just about having more recruitment, more diversity, more initiation, etc., etc. It's about kind of having a balance. You need to recruit, you have to bring in new members, but you also have to establish cohesion amongst your gang. And if there's too many new people coming in, that can make things less cohesive. We might have seen that with the Red Scorpions gang, for example. There was a lack of cohesion towards the end because of those different sets, the Abbotsford set and sort of the Tri-Cities set. Diversity is important in terms of, like, what I especially mean by this is age, and this is part of recruitment. If you're going to recruit new individuals, they need to be younger so that they'll last longer in the gang. One of the ways to establish gang cohesion and to make individuals stay in the gang longer is through initiation rites. So initiation rites can do a couple of things. They can make individuals feel like they're more part of something bigger, like they're part of a brotherhood, but they can also make people fearful to leave. If you're initiated, you might be by getting beat up or jumped in is the specific language. If you're jumped in to the gang, then you might fear what would happen to you if you leave the gang. Will you get beat up, or will you get beat up even more severely? The right type of criminal behavior is also necessary. If gangs are just overly violent, it will attract too much police attention, and gang members will just get incarcerated for their violent behavior. Gangs need to make money to also make it worthwhile to be in the gang, and as well to have funds for lawyers and things like that. So the criminal behavior of gangs must be disproportionately aimed at profit as opposed to status, such as involvement in violent offenses. Alliances can also help because it will create opportunities for a greater variability of criminal behavior. Having greater connections will, maybe you are able to sell cocaine or crack cocaine, but you don't have a connection to get heroin. And so an alliance with another gang might allow you to buy heroin from that gang so that you can sell it in the particular area that that gang is operating in. In Canada, I would say that there would be the 2 major sources of recruitment into gangs would be through friends and through family. We tend to see gangs in Canada recruit from a pool of people whom they already know. It's not like in the TV shows and movies where you see the older stranger watch a kid get beat up at school and then intervene and put his arm around the kid and say hey, stick with us, we'll take care of you, we'll make sure that you don't get beat up. We don't really see this sort of arm around the shoulder grooming in the Canadian context. And often individuals, like certain gangs don't need to recruit. Individuals will want to be gang involved and they will seek out opportunities to join gangs. One of the useful things about family recruitment is it can help promote longevity, because younger family members might feel like we can't leave the gang because it's not just leaving the gang, now it's like abandoning my actual literal biological family, not just like the figurative family of the gang, but the literal biological family is someone that you'd be leaving as well. So individuals who are recruited by family might be more likely to stay longer than individuals who are recruited by friends. There are different types of initiations. Crime commission is where an individual has to go out and commit a particular crime. We can see, as I mentioned, getting jumped in or beaten in, going on a mission, which is usually more about a violent type of offense, getting tagged in, which is where you might get tattooed or scarred, and then blessed in is when like a friend or a family member will just speak for you or vouch for who you are as a person and say like, I trust this person, they can be part of the gang, they don't have to do anything. Gangs don't restrict themselves to just one type of initiation strategy, but these are some of the more common ones. So for crime commission, it's about like having to go out and earn a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time to sort of show trust and prove loyalty to the gang. Getting beaten in is where an individual would have to withstand a beating from X number of gang members for X number of seconds. Sometimes they're allowed to fight back, other times they just have to accept the beating. Going on a mission is where an individual has to commit a specific crime for the gang that's usually related to violence. So for example, when I interviewed kids, one of the individuals who was gang involved told me that like he was given a firearm and told that he had to go and rob a crack shack and just get as much money as he possibly could, or as much drugs as he possibly could. Another one told me about how he was given a gun and they got into a car and they said like, we're going to go and find you a rival gang member to shoot. And this was all a ruse. They drove around in the car and pretended to not be able to find that gang member. So they found a random person on the street and said, okay, like prove that you want to be with us, go up and shoot that random person. So the kid got out of the car, pulled the trigger, and fortunately there were no bullets in the gun, but that was the gang's test. That was like, would you be willing to, like not even just shoot like a rival, would you be willing to shoot a random person on our behalf? At the beginning of the class, I talked about when police are looking at the prevalence of gangs, they're trying to figure out how much resources do we need to allocate to fighting gangs. But the most important question to first ask is whether gang members are actually different from other types of individuals involved in crime. So yeah, we might expect the average gang member to be more involved in crime than the average high school student or the average college student. But what about when it comes to other individuals who are actively involved in crime as well? Are gang members actually a high-risk group? We can answer the question of whether gang members are a high-risk group in a couple of ways. Maybe one of the simplest ways is just to compare the offending patterns of incarcerated gang members to the offending patterns of incarcerated persons who are not associated with gangs. So for most of the remainder of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the Incarcerated Serious and Violent Young Offender Study and what we've learned from this study in terms of differences between gang members and non-gang members, and then what some of the gang members have told us about their experiences being recruited or initiated into the gang. During my master's and PhD, I spent a lot of time in Burnaby and Victoria Youth Custody Centers interviewing both gang members and non-gang members. And we would ask kids incarcerated about different aspects of gang involvement. So we wouldn't just come out and say like, hey, are you gang involved, yes or no? We would have different questions about gang-related activity. And so you can see here 3 different types of individuals in the study. We have non-gang offenders, so these are the individuals who answered no to 4 different questions about gang activity. For individuals that answered yes to 1 or 2 questions about gang activity, we call them some gang involvement. And then individuals who answered yes to at least 3 out of the 4 questions about gang involvement were called those who were associated with major gang involvement. So that we could look at not only individuals who are gang members compared to non-gang members, but kind of also compare within gang members based on who was more or less involved in gang activity. What I guess we would be most interested here is comparing major gang involvement to non-gang involvement. And we can see the answer to a question of, are gang members a higher risk, is yes. Gang members spend more months incarcerated. They have a greater number of total convictions for violent offenses and a greater number of total convictions in general. We also see differences when we look at self-reported forms of offending. So we actually asked these individuals in the study about the age at which they first had police contact. We would ask them about specific types of violent or aggressive behavior. We would ask them about general delinquency and general offending. And here you can see that gang members had an earlier age of onset. They were more versatile in their level of violence, their level of delinquency, and their overall levels of offending as well. What's I think most important here is look at the age of police contact for those gang members who demonstrate major gang involvement. You'll notice, and it's also true for those with some gang involvement, that their police contact occurs before age 12. And now all of you are well aware of the YCJA, so you'll know that police contact for these individuals on average occurs before the police can even actually do anything formally about their gang involvement. So here's where we can begin to put all of what we're learning together. We know that the YCJA can't formally intervene. What are we going to do? Well, what we just talked about last week was the Stop Now and Plan program. So we need programs like this, and we can identify, okay, here's this kid, they're 11 years old, they've had police contact. Let's funnel them into the SNAP program to try and divert them from becoming a gang member, from becoming involved in a lot of different types of crime. We've learned that gang members commit more crime than non-gang members who are also incarcerated. The next question is, do gang members have a higher rate of offending than non-gang offenders only because they're gang involved? Like, is it gang involvement that's responsible for this greater level of offending? Or are gang members also associated with a whole bunch of different other risk factors that might increase why they might be involved in crime as well? So in our study, we found the vast majority of gang members were male rather than female. We also saw that for individuals that were white, they were relatively equally likely to be a non-gang member or some gang involvement or major gang involvement. Same thing for indigenous persons, where across each ethnic group, we don't really see much of a difference in terms of the likelihood of gang involvement. You might look at this and you're comparing like white to indigenous to non-indigenous minority groups, and you say, well, hey, like individuals who were white comprised 50% of major gang involvement, individuals who were indigenous comprised 30%, and individuals who were of a non-indigenous minority background comprised about 10-15%. So does that mean that white individuals are more likely to be gang involved compared to other groups? And the answer to this is no, because white individuals represented a greater proportion of the overall number of participants in the study. So we want to look within those different racial groups as opposed to between those different racial groups. So you can see, like, for both white persons and indigenous persons, there was like almost an identical number or percentage of individuals who showed major gang involvement and showed non-gang involvement. When we look at substance use, what we can definitely see is that those with major gang involvement had greater levels or problems with drug use compared to those who were involved in crime but were not gang members. So you can see that gang members began using alcohol at an earlier age, began using drugs at an earlier age. We can see that they're also more likely to be selling drugs, not really surprising. We can also see at the end of the graph on the right side that gang members were more likely to be motivated to commit crimes because of alcohol and because of drug use. So it's not just that they're motivated to commit crimes because of their gang involvement, they're actually motivated by substance use as well. We basically tell the same story when we look at family dysfunction amongst our participants. Gang members more likely to have left the home at an earlier age, more likely to have been kicked out of the home at an earlier age. We've got siblings who are involved in criminal behavior, and those siblings are motivating their involvement in crime. Their parents are motivating their involvement in crime, and their lack of supervision is motivating their involvement in crime greater than or more so to a greater extent compared to non-gang offenders. It's not just that gang members are motivated to commit crime because of their gang involvement. Substance use and family are also driving their involvement in criminal behavior. Based on these last slides, I'm not surprised to say that school characteristics or school problems were also more prevalent for gang members. Dropping out of school was more likely to be found as a motivating factor for crime for gang members compared to non-gang members. Okay, so we've learned about the fact that gang members seem to differ from non-gang offenders. Now we need to look within gang members to understand why they join their gangs and why they leave their gangs. During my PhD, I was lucky to expand on the data collection that we were doing thanks to Corinne Descormier, who is finishing her PhD, and so we interviewed gang members to ask them specifically about their experiences of gang involvement. So these were kids incarcerated at the Burnaby Youth Custody Center, and the majority of them said that they were influenced to join a gang by a friend. The next most common reason for joining a gang was being influenced by a sibling, and then lastly by a parent. So that's who helped bring the youth into the gang. But why was the youth motivated to join the gang? Most were motivated to join by money. You can see about 70% of individuals motivated to join by money. A similar amount wanted to join to deal drugs, which is kind of like wanting to join a gang to get money as well. Some were joining for power, some were joining to fit in. A much, much smaller percent, like maybe 5%, were joining the gang because they felt forced to join, like physically threatened, and they felt they had to join. What you'll also notice about these percentages is they don't add up to 100. We found that a single individual typically had multiple reasons for why they were joining the gang. Like they didn't just have one reason. We found a couple of key correlations as well. We found that Indigenous youth were more likely to be brought into the gang by a family member, whereas non-Indigenous youth were more likely to be brought into the gang or introduced to the gang by a friend. We also found that kids that were brought into the gang by family were more likely to spend more time in the gang and were more likely to join the gang at a younger age. And so this supports what we talked about earlier with recruitment, where recruitment by family members is likely to have a greater impact on the longevity of the gang. It's also more likely to have an impact on the longevity of gang members. These kids might have felt more trapped or more worried about leaving the gang because would that mean that they were leaving their family, for example. I already talked a little bit about types of initiations, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of these initiations on the young person. In total, about 3/4 of the gang members in our study were initiated, and 20% of those individuals experienced multiple initiations. So they weren't just initiated in one way. And we also found an association between the reason for why somebody would be motivated to join a gang and the likelihood that they were going to be initiated. So those that self-reported that they joined the gang to earn respect were also the ones who were most likely to experience an initiation. We also found that there was a relationship between how somebody joined the gang and the type of initiation they experienced. Those who felt like they were being physically threatened to join the gang were also the ones who were most likely to be beaten in. So basically to be assaulted to be able to join the gang. When asked about crime commission initiation experiences, kids said that they were usually required to earn trust, prove loyalty, defend their block, or meet specific financial targets, like they had to earn $1,000 drug dealing in one day, for example. For the jumping in or beating in experience, it could vary in length from 20 seconds to 15 minutes with an average of 3 minutes. It varied from one person fighting them to 14 people being involved with an average of 5 people being involved in assaulting them. And most were told that they were not allowed to fight back during the initiation experience. One thing to keep in mind is maybe we get some bravado and some macho attitudes when kids are talking here about whether they actually were being beaten in for 15 minutes. 15 minutes is a long, long time. 20 seconds is actually a really long time to experience an assault. When I was interviewing one individual, he talked to me about an initiation experience that I thought was really interesting. So I can't say what gang this was for, but it was for a fairly high-profile gang. And he was involved with a group of others in robbing a high-end jewelry store. And they used bear mace against a store employee, and they stole thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. But then they were found by police on the street, like 50 feet from the store entrance, just kind of like casually smoking a cigarette. You as a student might be wondering, like, well, you've just assaulted somebody, you've got all this jewelry, like why didn't they run? Why didn't they try to escape? They didn't try to escape or try to flee police, not get caught, because the initiation required them to get caught. The initiation was that they had to get caught for an indictable offense. So they had to commit an offense for which an adult would get 2 or more years in custody. They had to allow themselves to get caught, basically showing that they would be loyal to the gang, that they were willing to serve time for the gang. In contrast to the like blood in, blood out stuff that Lil Wayne and others talk about 20% of individuals in our sample had left the gang, and 80% of that 20%, so that would work out to be like 16 of the 20 individuals, were able to leave the gang without any consequence to them. They just left. Girls were also more likely to leave than boys, and some of the reasons that participants gave for leaving included the death of a family member, or they found that it was too stressful, bringing too much conflict to themselves. They found that maybe they could make more money by being independent, so they wanted to continue to be involved in crime, just thought that like as long as I don't have to do like pay rent or give these kickbacks to different people, I won't actually have to lose some of my profits, so I'll make more money. Others said they just kind of like grew up and grew tired of it. While we found that 20% of individuals left the gang, only 9% of indigenous youth who were gang involved reported leaving the gang. And this could be related to the fact that they were more likely to be recruited by their family. We also saw that those who did experience getting beaten in were less likely to report having left the gang, and so they might be particularly afraid, like if I got beaten in to join the gang, maybe I will get beaten out to leave the gang. Another concern could be that when individuals experience getting beaten in, they just went through something really awful. And it might be kind of like the gambler's fallacy, where they've put money or they've put time, effort into this thing, and they don't want to feel like that was all for waste. They don't leave the gang, even though they don't like it, because they want to make that initial experience feel worthwhile. If they got beaten in really severely, and they leave 3 weeks later, might feel like that assault was not worth it, so they might stay longer in the gang just to make it feel like getting beaten in was worth it. We asked kids who were involved in gangs about whether their gang had specific rules, and if they did, what happened when an individual violated those rules. And sometimes it would be related to like, you gotta pay money, you've got to clean, like you've got to do kind of the more mundane jobs of the gang. But one of the things that they would also talk about is if you violate a rule, then there will be violence perpetrated against those individuals who came from gangs where there was a rule about, or where violence was used in response to rule breaking, were less likely to leave the gang. The last thing that I'll end with, and if you find this interesting, I highly recommend you take Martin Bouchard's classes. He does one, I think, on organized crime and another one on maybe like street gang. Either way, I think both of those classes will talk about social network analysis. What is social network analysis? It's definitely not like looking through Facebook posts and Instagram or social media, anything like that. Social network analysis is actually based on graph theory. It's the idea about mapping an individual's connections. Who is an individual connected to, and what is the nature of their relationship? When mapping the networks of individuals, there's some key terminology that you need to know. So nodes that I've sort of used before in this class represent individuals or groups. So those different shapes, they can be circles, triangles, squares, whatever, they represent the individual of interest or the group of interest. So sometimes a node could represent a gang member. Sometimes it can represent a particular gang itself, like the gang unit itself. You'll see lines that connect nodes, and these lines are referred to as edges, and they can be used to denote the specific type of connection that two individuals have as well. Often we're interested in what are called ego networks. So we could look at a gang member and we would code all of his or her ties. So the ego is who we're looking at, and the alters are the people that they are connected to. And sometimes we might be specifically interested in who their co-offenders are, but I'm doing a large study right now where we're looking not just at co-offenders, but people who the individual has conflict with, or people who the individual has been victimized by, or people who the individual just socializes with. So these edges to alters can represent different types of ties. What we're also interested in is whether an individual's alters know one another. So you can see here, these dotted lines represent ties among alters. So on the very right-hand side, you might see that the alter is tied to only one of the other alters in the individual's ego network. But at the top of the ego network, you can see 3 alters, and those 3 alters are all connected to one another as well. What these networks allow us to do is identify who is a central or key player in the gang. And this means we can even identify people who are central to the gang that are not actually gang members. And there are different types of centrality. 2 types that I'll focus on for this class are degree centrality and betweenness centrality. Degree centrality just describes the number of different connections that a particular individual has to the other actors in a network, whether they're other egos or other alters. So it's just all about the raw number of connections. Betweenness centrality counts the number of instances in which an individual falls between 2 other actors who are otherwise unconnected. So this bridge allows your ego to connect person 1 to person 2, or alter 1 to alter 2. This can mean that they're in kind of like a powerful position. They can broker relations between these 2 individuals. So betweenness centrality might be especially common for individuals who are leaders of a gang. So I'll give you an example of what I think is a pretty cool study that I did with Martin Bouchard, where we looked at how gangs select who will commit a homicide offense. So how does somebody select who would be a suitable co-offender? If you were to commit a crime and you wanted to get some help, whether it's to steal a car, to do a break and enter, a bank robbery, how would you decide who you would recruit? Would you focus on someone you trust, like a best friend or a family member? Would you focus on somebody who has a history of committing break and enters or car thefts, someone who has the skills to actually go out and commit that type of an offense? So when gangs are committing a homicide offense, what qualities do they look for when selecting who is going to be involved in that type of homicide offense? So this is what we call the suitable co-offender. And some past literature has suggested that individuals with similar traits are more likely to co-offend together. So if they're of the same age, ethnicity, sex, that might increase the likelihood of them co-offending together. Past research has also suggested that by 2 individuals being a gang member, that might establish trust between them. They're both part of the same organization. You might also want to try and search out or seek persons who are of a particular prestige. So somebody who has a high level of centrality might be somebody who you want to connect with because they're popular amongst others, and that will allow you to get inside of that kind of inner circle. So what we wanted to do was look at how co-offenders are selected for a homicide offense. So what you see here is a network of 18 individuals that we interviewed who were all part of the same gang. We're just going to call them the BC gang. And we looked at their connections to different offenders. Individuals who have a yellow node are members of the BC gang. Individuals who have a blue node are members of a different gang or are a non-gang member, but they've been involved in crime in some way. So blue is a non-BC gang person. The white ties show co-offending ties, and the red ties show criminal associations. So they interacted with one another in prison, but they weren't actually co-offending together. What again you see here is a couple of really important things. Number 1, as I mentioned earlier, there are far more non-BC gang offenders than BC gang members in this network. So those 18 BC gang members were associated with about 100 non-BC gang offenders, and they were associated with, I don't know, maybe like 18 and 19 other members of the BC gang. So the vast majority of the individuals in this network were non-BC gang offenders. But you'll also notice some patterning in this network. The network analysis itself uses an algorithm that shapes the network in a specific way. That specific way is that the individuals who are more central to the gang are brought into the middle of the network, what we call a component. So in this component, you can see that almost all of the individuals in the very center of that network are BC gang members. So while the BC gang members represent a minority of individuals in the whole network, they are the majority of individuals who are in the center of the network. So what I really wanted to show you was this network. In this case, the red edges represent individuals who committed a homicide offense together, and the white edges represent individuals who committed a non-homicide co-offense together. Normally, if we were in lecture, I get to ask you about what you see, but we don't really get to talk back and forth here, so I'm just going to tell you what's important. What you'll notice is that, again, the GM subscripts represent gang members, and those nodes with no subscript are non-BC gang offenders. If you look closely, you'll find that every single homicide co-offense only involved individuals who were BC gang members. So we have 137 individuals in this network. About 100 of them are non-gang members, or at least not members of the BC gang. And yet 100% of the homicide offenses that we see in this network were perpetrated by gang members. So basically what this means is that homicide offending was a gang-only offense. If a gang wanted to commit a homicide offense, they would only recruit fellow gang members. They were very likely to be working with non-gang members for other types of crime, as you can see in the network. But when it came to homicide offenses, it seemed like they only trusted other gang members to do the job. So we'll go through the story of this network because there were 3 different homicide offenses that occurred. The first one you can see here. So you can see GM1, GM7, and a few others, about 5 others, co-offended together to commit their first homicide offense. On the left, you see GM7's Dial-A-Dope network, and on the right, you see GM1's Dial-A-Dope networks. Once again, all of the homicide offenders were gang involved. This doesn't look too much different, but if you look at the bottom, you'll see GM4 and GM230 who committed another homicide offense. And then what was really interesting is we see a third homicide offense. And this third homicide offense was 6 offenders that GM1 recruited. GM1 was the leader of the gang. And in that first offense, GM1 had committed that homicide offense with GM3. Now, like 15 years later, GM1 is re-recruiting GM3 as well as a bunch of others to commit this new homicide offense. And this is the part where I let you know that the homicide offense that GM1 committed with GM3 and their other homicide co-offenders was perpetrated against somebody in this network. And I would ask you, who do you think is in this network that would be most likely to be targeted for a homicide offense? And the answer is GM7. And here's why. Let's take a look back at this other slide where we saw GM1 and GM7, they had committed a homicide offense together. They were friends at one point in time, 15 years ago. But have a look at GM1's Dial-A-Dope network and have a look at GM7's Dial-A-Dope network. And what do you notice? You might notice that for GM1's Dial-A-Dope network, it's almost all gang members. For GM7's Dial-A-Dope network, he is working outside of the gang. He is developing his own kind of set, his own sort of clique of non-BC gang offenders, and they are all kind of sharing in the profits. So the profit isn't necessarily helping with the gang or the gang's level of cohesion. And so this is in part why GM1 effectively ordered a hit against GM7. There's so much more that I would like to talk about, so if you're interested in this, please come to office hours. But I wanted to try and keep this like somewhat short because I know that we're getting towards the end of the semester and students are getting a little bit tired. But if you do have more questions or you want to know more, like absolutely feel free to stop by during office hours. I can talk a little bit more about gang involvement and what we're learning about youth gangs. So this was the last lecture that students are required to watch for the exam. I know it's been a really long semester, but I really appreciate all of the participation that students have been providing on Canvas in response to the discussion questions, all of the presentations that you're working on, the papers. I know that this has been a lot of work in this class, but I appreciate it. I hope that you've gotten something out of the class. Keep in mind that I'll still do another 2 lectures, but none of them are required viewing. But the final exam review will be helpful, obviously, for preparing for the final exam. So that's it. If I don't talk to you, have a good break, and hopefully you will continue on in your degrees in criminology. Take care, everybody.